episode 155. I believe achieving success in the outdoor biz is dependent upon embracing the outdoor lifestyle and learning from outdoor leaders that came before you. If you agree, then listen up for tips, advice, and hacks about growing or starting your career in the outdoor biz. My name is Rick Sayes. Welcome to the Outdoor Biz Podcast. I'm looking forward to sharing my conversation with Willow Belden from the Out There Podcast. But first, if you're thinking about starting your own podcast for your brand or passion project, I've created a free cheat sheet outlining 6 fundamental steps for building and starting your podcast. It has everything you need to know about planning, building, and launching. Head over to ricksayes.com and download this free resource today. Great conversation with fellow podcaster Willow Belden today. Willow produces the Out There Podcast and tells us about the show, how she got into podcasting, and her experience as an NPR host on Wyoming Public Radio. Enjoy. Hey, Willow, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on. Great to be talking with a fellow podcaster. This is a first for me.
Yeah, that's always fun.
Yeah, very exciting, yeah. So what was your first exposure to the outdoors? How did you get excited about the outdoor lifestyle?
Well, I think so. Growing up, I lived in New York City, which is not exactly outdoorsy.
Right.
But my family had this little cabin up in Maine, which my grandfather had bought land on a lake up there, like way back when it was dirt cheap, and then they built this cabin.
Nice.
And so summers, I often spent most of the summer up there, and we would kayak and swim and just kind of spend all day outside. I remember entire summers where I never wore shoes.
Very good.
Except maybe if my mom made me if we had to go to the grocery store or something. But that was always sort of my happy place, and I guess that got under my skin.
Very fun. Yeah. So you just swim and kayak, and did you ever go to a camp or anything? That kind of thing?
I didn't. My mom was on an academic schedule because she taught at a university, and so she had summers off also. And so we, like I said, we usually just headed up to this little place in Maine and played all summer. It was sort of idyllic, or at least I remember it that way. I don't know what it actually was for idyllic. Her, but
yeah. It sounds very fun, yeah. And have you had a traditional outdoor job? I know we were talking earlier, we worked in radio. Did you do anything? Did you work retail or anything?
Yeah, I did. Actually, my very first job was at an outdoor gear store, like an outfitter store, and this was in high school. And, it was one of those things where I just I knew the owners, and I just sort of talked my way into it, even though they didn't really have a job opening.
Nice, good.
And did that for a bunch of summers through high school and part of college, I guess, until I started, looking for internships and things like that. But
what was the shop?
It was called Northwoods Outfitters, and it was actually up in Maine where our little cabin was. And it was, it got to be the kind of thing where in high school I was like, well, yeah, I can go goof off in Maine all summer, but I also need some spending money. Like I wasn't, getting money from parents anymore. And so that kind of sustained me.
Yeah, very cool. That's a great shop. I've never been to that shop, but I've heard of it. Yeah, it's a cool place.
Yeah.
And so tell our audience about your experience as a podcaster. Your podcast is the Out There Podcast?
Yep, it's called Out There.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was got started actually. So I have a background in public radio. That's kind of where I come to this from. And I had been working for Wyoming Public Radio, which is the NPR station in Wyoming, for several years, and that had been, or I thought that was going to be my dream job. I mean, it was one of those things where I had gone to grad school for this. I had,
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had.
You were committed.
I was committed. I mean, I had been working as a journalist pretty much ever since college, but in print, and then I went back to grad school because I wanted to get into radio. And then I got this job at Wyoming Public Radio, kind of fresh out of grad school, and it was one of those things where it was a really good job, and I loved my colleagues, and it was interesting, and I felt like my work was meaningful, all the things that a job is supposed to be.
Yeah, right. Ideally, yeah.
Yeah, right. And it even came with an income that gave me the kind of quality of life that I wanted. But I didn't love it enough. It was one of those things where it was a high stress job and you were always on deadline. And I just didn't love it enough to make it worth the amount of stress it was. And so people would always say, well, what would you rather be doing? And I kind of said, well, if I knew that, I'd probably already be doing it, know?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I know I don't want to do this, but I don't know what I want to do. Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Exactly. And so finally I said, I don't think I'm going to figure out what I want to do instead while I'm still at this job. I think I need to get away from everything for a while. And so I decided to quit and go through hike the Colorado Trail, which is, it goes from Denver to Durango. It's 500 miles. So it's like a mini through hike.
Yeah. But still, you're out there for a period of time. That'll let you think and clear your thoughts.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I was out there. I mean, it was about 5 weeks that I was out there. And, but I just had this feeling that I needed to kind of get away from everything and have some time to think and figure stuff out.
So let me go back a little bit. What was the stress? Was just from the deadlines, just constantly having to get stuff done on time? Yeah.
Constant deadlines, constant wrangling people who didn't want to talk to you to talk about things that they didn't want to talk about. Right. I mean, there were parts of the job that I really did love, but it's like, when you hear about people who talk about getting out of bed every morning, excited about what they're going to do that day. I didn't have that. Yeah. Or at least most of the time I didn't have that.
Yeah. So
and it was also tough hours. I mean, when you were hosting Morning Edition, you had to be at work at 5 a.m. and,
I didn't think about that. Yeah. Yeah. If you're not a morning person, that'd be rugged.
Well, even if you are a morning person, it's still, like getting up at 4 a.m. means that you have to go to bed at like 8 p.m. And so you don't get to have a social life,
Yeah,
it's sort of hard. Yeah. Everyone else is not on your schedule.
Yeah. And if you're in Wyoming, you got to deal with the snow and the weather in the wintertime, I bet.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Interesting. So a through hike will get you in a good place, I would think. That must have been a great adventure.
It was. And I was not a backpacker at all. Like, I think before I went to do, I know, I was, I think I had gone backpacking maybe twice for like a night.
Oh, so it's kind of like off the couch through hiking.
Yeah, and I had never gone alone. And so I was like, okay, let me go hike 500 miles by myself. What could possibly go wrong?
Nice. Well, that's a bigger adventure than I anticipated then. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but I did a bunch of research and, meticulously I made spreadsheets about gear, and I was that person, bought books and, talked to everybody. So, so I did this hike and at the end of it, I remember, after I got back, like a few days after I got home after this hike, I was listening to the radio and, listening to my former colleagues. And I was like, well, I really don't miss doing that.
Oh, wow.
But I do miss telling stories through audio. And I want to do that, but I want to go deeper and I want to get more personal. And I want to be telling more, narrative stories rather than just like the news. I shouldn't say just the news. I have huge respect for news reporters. It just wasn't what was making me happy.
But storytelling is different than the news. Way different. I mean, better than a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I had sort of in the back of my mind, I had this idea for an outdoor related podcast for a while, but I never had time to really pursue it while I was working full time. And so it had just kind of, been shelved. And now I was back and I had quit my job to go through hike the trail. So I didn't have a job lined up. So all of a sudden I had nothing but time.
Yeah, right.
And kind of said, you know what, let's see if we could give this a go, cool. and see what happens.
So where
and
do you think
4 years ago? So here I am, 4 years later.
plugging away? That's great. Yeah. Where do you think the inspiration for the podcast came from? You said it was kind of in the back of your mind. Was it about storytelling, or what do you think fostered that?
No, it's a good question. So I mean, I think the general idea had been in the back of my mind for a while, and I don't honestly know where that came from. I think it was just I enjoyed, outdoor adventures and was sort of intrigued by it.
Mm-hmm.
But the more specific idea for like what this show would be, as opposed to all the other outdoor podcasts that are out there, I think that materialized through hiking the Colorado Trail. Because for me, it was a very contemplative experience.
Mm-hmm.
It was one that I mean, obviously it was a physical experience too, but I think it was one of those ones that made me reflect a lot on a lot of different aspects of life and society and relationships and science and all these things. And so I suddenly said, I think a lot of us who spend time outdoors find that that it's a way to get at some of life's bigger questions. And so maybe we can create a podcast that tells stories that also do that. And so, so that's out there is very much focused on looking at the bigger questions behind these outdoor stories. It uses outdoor stories to get at bigger questions. So like, you'll have a story about a trip up Mount Everest, but the real story is about how do we make moral decisions, like whether or not to leave someone for dead if you come across someone who's dying near the summit of Mount Everest, those kinds of things.
Well, I listened to a couple of your episodes, and you're right. I mean, your show, it's really great because any of us that have spent a lot of time on the trail, your mind just wanders and you think about a wide range of things, everything from, geez, I think I left the coffee pot on, to, what am I going to do when I turn 80 or 70 or all these big life questions. So it's a wide-ranging thought process that goes on the trail. And I think your show captures that, at least a couple episodes I listened to. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, that's the goal anyway. So
that's awesome. And so what are you most proud of with the show 4 years in?
Yeah, well, I think the ability of the show to appeal to people who are not necessarily hardcore outdoorsy types, because I find that a lot of outdoor journalism appeals specifically to people who are sort of diehard. So if you're going to read a rock climbing magazine, you're probably not going to be interested in it unless you're already really into climbing, or the same. And so I feel like there are a lot of people who get left behind with that, and who are interested but just feel like they're not part of the club, and so they don't know how to get in.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of open the door for them to say, no, this can be for you also. And we have done that, I think. I mean, obviously, many of our listeners are outdoor enthusiasts, but we also have a lot of listeners who are, in cities, and their typical encounters with the outdoors is a run in the park. They're not the scaling mountains or,
and I think
doing grand adventures.
And I think you've tapped into a shift in the outdoors as it continues to mature and evolve. It's getting more inclusive and more broad, and we realize that we all started out making gear that would survive. We could survive on Mount Everest, and then 20 years in, you realize, what? I don't really need a $500 jacket that's going to keep me warm and dry on Mount Everest. I'm not going.
I'm just going on a day hike here. Yeah,
I'm going to the campground. Exactly. I'm going to be sleeping in my trailer or a cabin or whatever. So
totally.
I think over the years, we're a lot more relaxed, if you will, and inclusive. So that's great. That's awesome that you've captured that. The two episodes I listened to definitely were spot on, I think, in that it's a more recreational person in the backcountry, and there are all those people out there all over the place. So
yeah,
good for
absolutely.
You. What part of podcasting have you found most challenging? You probably had the technical side down, which has been some of the most challenging for me.
Yeah, the technical and the storytelling side, that was pretty straightforward for me, coming from a radio background. I mean, the biggest challenge for me personally has been how to make money from it. It's
well, when you
one of
figure
those,
that out, let me know.
yeah, right. It's one of those those Wild West kind of most independent podcasters haven't really figured out how to make a living off of this
It's
yet.
a passion project. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, myself included. But for me, it's a full-time job at this point. So, pressure's on. And
I did it. I got laid off is how I started mine and figured
I'm sorry.
to wait for something to do. But then I got back to work. So I'm working now, but the daytime job gets in the way of the podcast of all the other things I'd love to do. So I can relate to that. Yeah.
Well, in the first few years, I did have a part-time day job still. In fact, I was working at an outdoor store
cool.
a few days a week to to make it all work financially.
Get the gear deals and make a few money.
Yeah, right. And then about a year ago, I quit that. So I've been doing it full time. So it's a full-time job. I always joke it's a full-time job, but definitely not a full-time paycheck.
Right.
So that's been tough, both for me and I want to be. Most of our stories are done by freelance producers and writers across the country, and I can't pay them anywhere near what they deserve, and I hate that. It's like I want to be able to treat them well, and I can't. So
yeah.
I mean, I can be a fun editor, but I can't pay them what I deserve. So on a personal level, it's definitely been that. I think, the business end of it, the money end of it.
And you've done the same research we've all probably done on looking at how to monetize a podcast, use sponsorships and various ways.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and we do sponsorships. In fact, we just recently hired a new person to sell ads for us.
Oh, cool.
So,
and you have some good sponsors. Yeah, I mean, Thrive Market. That's great. They're pretty significant.
Yeah, we've had some good sponsors. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but the amount that you get from sponsors is directly tied to the number of listeners you have.
And
so
the CPM model.
It's
exactly.
or it tends to be so. For a smaller show, and I mean, we're doing well for an independent podcast numbers wise in terms of how many listeners we have, but I think we need to do better in order to bring in more money.
You always want to do better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, have you had any mentors that have helped you along the way?
I have, and I was thinking through that last night. I would say there have been mentors in different realms because this is a project that sort of spans, like it's about the outdoors, but it's also a journalistic project.
Right.
I would say on the journalism front, especially on the audio front, the news director at Wyoming Public Radio, who I worked for several years, was definitely a mentor, and he was one of those. He was one of those people who gave you the space to experiment, but also gave you the support you needed to, to learn from your mistakes. And I think, one of the things that I remember him saying at one point, because I tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, sometimes to my own detriment. Like sometimes you just got to let it go, but I'm not good at that. Yeah. So I remember I was agonizing over a story at one point, and I was probably just going off about how this wasn't working and that wasn't working and all these pieces weren't falling into place. And he looks at me and he goes, "Willow, not every story has to be a gem. It's okay. Just do the story."
That's good advice.
It's good advice for life and whatever you're doing, in life.
Those of us that are perfectionists, it doesn't always have to be spot on. You can let it fudge a little. It won't be the end of the world, but it's hard to do.
And you're probably going to notice all the mistakes, or not mistakes, but you're going to notice all the things that aren't as perfect as you would like, more than your average audience member.
That's a surprising thing. I think that's the hardest thing to learn, at least for me, is, most people don't, you talk about something, they say, really, I missed that, so it's interesting.
Yeah. And, I was thinking about it. I think, honestly, like one of the other people who, I don't know if I would call this a mentor, but I had a professor in college, in undergrad, who he was a political science professor actually, but he had been my advisor, and so we had worked together fairly closely. And then a few years ago, shortly after I started out there, I was back on campus for some event, and so I had dinner with this professor, and he the event that I was there for was like a career event for international studies majors, and I had been an international studies major, and so they had invited a few of us back to campus to talk to students, and I was kind of thinking. It was cool, but I also had this sort of imposter syndrome going on where I was like, I don't know why they invite, like, am I the cautionary tale here? Like, I'm not really, like, I'm not earning a living doing what I'm doing. You know, I just I was feeling very insecure about it, and it was still in the early days of Out There. So, you know, our listenership was still fairly small then. It hadn't, you know, it was just, I was feeling very insecure about it. And so I voiced this to this professor of mine, Dave Rowe, and he said, oh, but, because I said, I just don't think I'm a success story yet. Or maybe never will be. I don't know. And he looked at me and he said, well, but are you doing something interesting? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, are you happy doing it? And I said, well, yeah, I'm very happy doing it. And he said, well, then you're a success. Yeah. And I was like, and it was surprising to me because he had always struck me as this, he was not a touchy-feely professor. Like, he was not one of those, like, kumbaya, follow your dreams kind of people. He was like, no, like, work hard and succeed. Like, you know. So to hear this from him, I was just like, oh. Yeah. Oh,
how come you never told me that while I was in class?
Yeah, right. Like, I wish I had known that in undergrad. Why did I have to wait 10 years? But, you know.
That's interesting. Anyway. Where'd you go to school?
I went to undergrad at Kenyon College in Ohio.
Oh, okay.
Which was wonderful.
Where did you grad work?
Graduate school, I went to Columbia to their journalism program.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, and I guess, too, you know, someone who's graduated college, right? A graduate, if you're coming back to speak to kids who haven't graduated, you're a success because you made it through, right? And those kids, you know, you think about back to those days thinking, God, I flunked out and then had to go back and change my major and get my act together. So it was kind of a big deal. Am I ever going to get this done? You know, so someone like that, someone who comes back with a degree, it's like, okay, well, it is possible.
Right. You can do this.
Yeah. It's a totally different perspective. That's interesting. And do you guys work with any nonprofits on the show, or
not on the show? I do personally. I actually got involved with a new nonprofit here in Wyoming that's working to coordinate volunteer efforts on public lands. So we sort of serve as a liaison between the entities that manage the land, so like the Forest Service and the county and things like that. We serve as a liaison between them and all the other groups that have projects they want to get done, but, you know, don't have permission to, like, you know, every group and their grandmother can't just go do volunteer projects on public land. So so we've sort of become the link there. And that just started up. It's called Common Outdoor Ground, and it's quite new, but it's got a lot of momentum, and you know, we're trying to tie together lots of different user groups, so it's not just, you know, the mountain bikers or the rock climbers or the skiers.
Get the birders involved and get the
birders involved. Get the ATVers or snowmobilers involved. Get the you know, the cattle women involved. You know, it's like we're trying to be a little bit more inclusive there. So that's been fun.
That's great. We'll link to those guys in the show notes. That's great. That's a good group. That sounds like a good project. I think most public lands, you know, around the country could use more volunteer help, and there's a lot of people that have time and are willing to. So
there are, and I think there's just so much red tape to get volunteer projects approved for an entity like the Forest Service, that all these, you know, individual groups just weren't managing to do it. And so the idea, so that we have like a group volunteer agreement that's you know, with the Forest Service, that's just a blanket statement, so then we can partner with other groups to do things. So
very cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
And what outdoor activities do you participate in? You still hike, I'm sure?
I do. I love hiking. I haven't done as much backpacking as I would like to since the Colorado Trail. Unfortunately, you can't quit your job every year and go do a thru hike.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, so that, and in the winter I cross country ski a lot, and we've got beautiful trails right here.
Mm-hmm.
I mountain bike, although I had a bad accident last year, so that's been, I'm trying to overcome some fear there.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
I've recently taken up rock climbing as well, which I've really come to love. So,
cool.
despite having a huge fear of heights growing up,
Oh, interesting.
yeah. So,
well, that'll help you overcome that. I mean,
yeah, it has though. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, do you have any suggestions or advice for folks wanting to get into the outdoor biz or grow their career or get into podcasting, maybe?
Yeah, I feel like this, and this is advice that I think could work for any of those categories.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us are hesitant to take a leap and try new things if we don't feel like we already have the skills to do them.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly was that way, where it's like, well, I don't already know how to do this, so I can't do it. And I think honestly, hiking the Colorado Trail was, that was something where I didn't know how to do it, but I did a bunch of research and I figured it out and it worked. And because that worked, then I think that gave me the courage to launch out there, because I was like, well, all right, I don't know how to do this either, but we're going to give it a try and figure it out and see. And so I think it's important to just remember that it's okay to be a beginner at things, and that if you want something enough, you can do the research you need, and you can talk to the people who know how to do it, and make it happen. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like anything you want to do is possible, but it is important to remember that you don't have to already know how to do everything in order to get started with something and in order to thrive at it.
Yeah. Most things are learnable. Some just take a little longer and require a little more, maybe certain techniques and skills, but everything's learnable. So
for sure.
That's great. Do you have any daily routines to keep your sanity? You meditate? You walk the dog?
Don't have a dog. I do. I do try to get out as much as possible. So it depends on the season what that looks like. In the winter, I'll go cross country skiing probably 4 or 5 days a week.
Nice.
Which is nice. And in the summer, that turns into, a hike or a bike ride or something like that. But I find that that getting out and getting active is what calms the anxiety and gets me centered again.
Getting out.
So I do that as much as I can.
That's awesome. It's easier to do in the summer when we have longer days, right?
Yeah, right. It is, although I don't know. We're lucky to have ski trails 10 minutes from my house, so I can go for an hour,
that's
at
nice,
lunchtime if I want to, and it's not a big deal.
That's great. Yeah, I'm down in the city of Bishop, so we don't get much snow, but the snow is close by, and plenty of other trails to walk on in the wintertime. So it's beautiful.
Yeah, we get all the snow.
We got plenty this year in the hills, so it's a good thing. Do you have any favorite books, or do you give books as gifts very often?
Yeah, so, I think, and this is, I'm sure you've heard this from other people too. This is not very original, but Wild by Cheryl Strayed was one that really hit home for me in terms of this idea, both in terms of the idea of doing something that you don't already know how to do, but also in terms of, just kind of like getting your life back on track after it's kind of spun out of control. So that I've given to a bunch of people. Another one that I really enjoyed, and I actually interviewed the author on the show, is called 60 Meters to Anywhere by Brendan Leonard.
Interesting.
And it's about him getting over alcoholism by learning to rock climb.
Oh, wow.
And it's just a really compelling story, well told, and again, I think it's one of those stories where it's like, okay, you've hit rock bottom. Now what? So
that's good. We'll link to both of those in the show notes. I'll have to check out 60 Meters to Anywhere. I interviewed Pete Ripmaster from Asheville on the show I guess it's been a few months ago now. He won the Iditarod last year.
Oh, wow.
On foot, not without sled dogs. He just, self-supported. And
oh my gosh. Okay.
He credits that to helping him battle through a lot of depression issues that he's had. It's a pretty interesting story. He should write a book. It's a pretty interesting story, similar.
Right.
Yeah, I can't imagine, but amazing. How about your favorite piece of outdoor gear under $100?
Under $100, I would probably have to say, actually, several of my favorite pieces of gear are under $100. So this is an easy one for me. No, I would say I have a pair of Dirty Girl gaiters, and so they're like these little gaiters that go over your shoes or your hiking boots, not to keep your feet dry, but to keep out pebbles and dust and schmutz from getting in your shoes. I think they were actually developed for trail running, and I'm not a runner, but they're wonderful for hiking, and I don't know, they've made it so much pleaser when you don't get all sorts of nasty stuff in your shoes. It sounds silly, but it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. I've been there. Your shoes can fill up, and you wonder how. I was on a trail. How did this happen? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
That's great. I like it. We'll link to those in the show notes too. As we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners or ask of our audience?
I think you've covered it pretty well.
Cool. Well, good. Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure talking to you. How can people follow up with you if they want to ask any questions or follow up on?
Sure. Well, so out there is we're all the places you can get podcasts. So we're on iTunes and Google Play Music and Spotify and Stitcher and all of that.
Cool.
And our website is outtherepodcast.com.
Great. Well, we'll link to all those in the show notes too. Definitely.
Perfect.
People can follow up and listen to your show. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'll look forward to meeting you
this has
someday.
been great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, good to chat with you. And we'll. Do you ever go to Outdoor Retail Show?
I haven't. I keep thinking about it, and my business partner and I were actually going to go this winter, but she was in the process of moving, when it was happening, and so we didn't. So. At some point, I'd like to make it there.
Yeah, it's close to Denver too. You could just drive out.
Right, I know it's real close. It's just a couple hours away from me. So at some point, hopefully.
Yeah, summers might be a better show for you. It's a little more, it's more of the summer outdoor hiking crowd than the winter ski crowd. But either one's good. They're both great shows to attend. So
exactly right. Well, and summer. The problem with the summer show is that summer is the best time of year to be outside. I don't want to be in a convention center.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the issue. Well, maybe we'll connect up with the show one of these days. And good luck with the rest of your podcast. And I'll talk to you again
you as
soon.
well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's been great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you want more of the Outdoor Biz Podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to go to theoutdoorbizpodcast.com where you find all the episodes, show notes, and much, much more. Until next time, be sure to make time to get outside.